Germany, February 1944. At 25,000 feet, the sky above the Reich looks like a frozen ocean. Silent, cold, endless. Then the stillness shatters. Black flak bursts bloom among the silver bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force. Tracer rounds streak upward. German Bf-109s slice through the clouds like steel arrows. Inside the cockpits of the American escorts, a new generation of pilots watches them approach. Calm, calculating. Instead of holding tight around the bombers, the Mustangs dive away, scattering across the sky. To the untrained eye, it looks like chaos. To the Luftwaffe, it's a trap. For the first time, the hunters of the Reich are being hunted themselves. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal test of endurance. The U.S. 8th Air Force, operating from cold, rain-soaked bases in eastern England, was attempting something no other air arm had done before: daylight precision bombing deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The theory was simple: destroy the factories, cripple the fuel, and force the Third Reich to collapse from within. In practice, it was a slaughter. Every daylight raid sent hundreds of lumbering B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators into skies dominated by the Luftwaffe's elite Jagdgeschwader units. Without long-range escorts, bomber crews faced the deadliest air defenses on Earth: radar-guided flak, disciplined fighter wings, and veteran German aces with hundreds of kills to their names. The Americans believed their heavy bombers, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, could fight their way to the target and back. It was a belief born of optimism, not experience. When the first raids reached targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943, formations were shredded. Dozens of bombers fell in minutes, their crews descending in parachutes or vanishing in fireballs. For the Luftwaffe, these missions were confirmation that the Reich could still hold the skies. For the Americans, they were a lesson written in blood. Back in England, mission debriefings revealed the same haunting patterns: bomber formations breaking apart once escorts turned home, German fighters striking with ruthless coordination, American gunners firing blind into empty sky. The losses became unsustainable. Commanders like General Ira Eaker knew something had to change. The U.S. could not afford to lose both bombers and trained crews faster than they could be replaced. But without a fighter that could fly to Berlin and back, the bombers would remain targets. That need, endurance, speed, and altitude performance, gave rise to an aircraft that would rewrite the rules of air combat: the North American P-51 Mustang. When the first P-51Bs reached the 354th Fighter Group in late 1943, they carried something revolutionary: a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license in the U.S. Outmatched, giving the sleek fighter unmatched range and high-altitude power. Suddenly, the possibility of escorting bombers all the way to the target was real. Yet even with the Mustang's arrival, U.S. doctrine remained cautious. Fighter groups were ordered to stay with the bombers at all costs. Pilots were forbidden to pursue the enemy beyond formation boundaries. Protection, not offense, was the mission. It was a rule that made sense on paper, but one that ignored the chaos of combat. And among the young American pilots flying over Europe, frustration was beginning to boil. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force was at a crossroads. The daylight bombing campaign was faltering, morale was strained, and the Luftwaffe still ruled its own airspace. Yet within the ranks of American Fighter Command, a new kind of leadership was emerging: bold, restless, and unwilling to accept defeat. Colonel Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, was one of them. A pre-war American volunteer with the Royal Air Force's Eagle squadrons, Blakesley had already spent years fighting the Luftwaffe before the U.S. even entered the war. He understood their methods and their psychology. His group's motto, "Fourth but First," reflected his conviction that American pilots must think and fight like predators, not guardians. Another was Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, a tactician and strategist who saw air combat as a living chessboard. Zemke studied enemy flight formations, timing, and altitude advantages. He knew that rigid escort rules, keeping fighters tethered to bomber formations, played directly into the Luftwaffe's hands. Both men began quietly bending the rules. When German fighters massed ahead of a bomber stream, Zemke's and Blakesley's groups would surge forward to meet them, intercepting before they could strike. It was unofficial, even insubordinate, but it worked. In London, General Jimmy Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, took notice. Unlike his predecessors, Doolittle believed that victory in the air would not come from defense, but offense. On January 6, 1944, he issued a simple but revolutionary order. Fighters are to engage and destroy the enemy whenever and wherever they can be found. It was a turning point in doctrine, and a declaration of freedom for U.S. fighter pilots. Now, the escorts were no longer shackled to the bombers. Instead, they were unleashed ahead of them, sweeping the airspace clean before the slow, vulnerable bombers arrived. Fighter groups began conducting free hunts, roving patrols that dove into German formations miles before the bomber stream. At first, some commanders feared chaos, that breaking formation would leave bombers exposed. But results spoke louder than skepticism. German losses began to climb. Their once invincible defense zones over central Germany were collapsing. For the Luftwaffe, the change was alarming. Their enemy, once predictable and reactive, had become aggressive and elusive. Their aces, veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, now faced opponents who attacked first, faster, and from unexpected angles. The balance of the air war was shifting, not through superior numbers alone, but through the daring of men who refused to fight by the book. And as spring approached, those new tactics would be tested in the deadliest skies of the war. War has always been fought with machines, but won by men. By 1944, the American air war over Europe had evolved into a contest not just of firepower, but of adaptation, a struggle to think faster, act bolder, and trust instinct over instruction. The human angle, courage under fire. The men who flew those missions were young, most barely in their 20s, many on their first trip away from home. They lived in Nissen huts along muddy English airfields, rising before dawn to briefings that decided who might not return. For them, fear was a constant companion, but so was determination. Each sortie demanded nerve. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Frost formed on the inside of oxygen masks, and the skin of bare hands could freeze to metal throttles. Yet even in that hostile void, American pilots began to push limits. They learned to trust their instincts, diving head-on into German formations, rolling out of attacks at treetop height, and improvising mid-combat when radios failed or wings iced over. These weren't just soldiers following orders. They were innovators, adapting second by second. Survival required it. The tactical angle, breaking the chain traditional escort doctrine. Stay with the bombers had created a cage in the sky. Once freed by Doolittle's order, fighter groups began experimenting in the air. Instead of tight defensive screens, squadrons spread out into attack waves, patrolling ahead of bomber routes. Colonel Zemke's 56th Fighter Group developed what became known as the Zemke Fan, a staggered fan-shaped formation that covered vast areas of sky. The tactic forced the Luftwaffe to split its strength, engaging multiple American subgroups instead of one large formation. Meanwhile, Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group perfected offensive sweeps, striking German airfields before takeoff or intercepting returning fighters low on fuel. Every new tactic chipped away at the Luftwaffe's once unshakable coordination. What had once been an orderly German defense network turned into a reactive scramble. The technological angle, the machine, that made it possible. At the heart of this revolution was the airplane that finally matched American daring, the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, and balanced, it could climb higher, dive faster, and turn tighter than anything the Americans had flown before. Its combination of aerodynamic efficiency and the British Merlin engine made it lethal at high altitude, exactly where the bombers flew and where the Bf-109s once ruled. With external fuel tanks, the Mustang's range stretched to nearly 1,600 kilometers, long enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back, something no Allied fighter had done before. But the P-51 wasn't just a machine. It was an equalizer. Its stability at high speeds allowed even average pilots to perform with precision. Its 650 caliber Brownings packed a deadly punch that could shatter enemy aircraft in a single burst. To the Luftwaffe, the P-51 represented more than a threat. It was a symbol of inevitability. Every mission that reached deeper into Germany meant fewer safe skies, fewer places to hide, and fewer veteran pilots left to fight. The American flyers knew it too. For the first time, they weren't merely protecting the bombers. They were taking control of the war above the Reich. The next phase would prove whether this daring new form of aerial warfare could truly turn the tide. The leadership angle, commanders. Who rewrote the sky, the success of the new American air tactics was not an accident. It was the product of leadership that defied convention. Colonel Don Blakesley and Colonel Hubert Zemke became symbols of a new era. Officers who led from the cockpit, not the map room. Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group operated like a pack of wolves, disciplined yet unpredictable. He demanded aggression and precision in equal measure. His pilots often joked that Blakesley didn't believe in altitude, he believed in attack. Under his command, they hit German formations from every angle, diving out of the sun, climbing through contrails, or striking stragglers as they turned for home. Zemke, on the other hand, treated every mission like an evolving puzzle. His wolf pack became famous for coordination. One element would bait German fighters into a climb, while others cut in behind for the kill. He taught his men to think ahead of the enemy, not merely react to them. Both leaders instilled confidence. They turned young pilots into tacticians, emphasizing adaptability over obedience. In doing so, they quietly reshaped U.S. fighter doctrine, from escort to domination. The enemy angle, the Luftwaffe's slow unraveling across the front. The Luftwaffe was feeling the strain. Germany's elite fighter arm, once the pride of the Reich, was being bled dry. By 1944, most of its veteran aces, men like Walter Oso, Egon Mayer, and Adolf Galland, were stretched across multiple sectors, forced to command and fight simultaneously. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement pilots arrived with barely a few hours of combat flight time. The American shift to offensive tactics only made things worse. Now, German pilots faced attacks before even reaching their intended targets. The once tight defensive rings that had protected cities like Hamburg and Hanover began to crack. Luftwaffe controllers, overwhelmed by radar contacts, often sent inexperienced pilots into hopeless fights. Those who survived faced another challenge: Allied strafing attacks on their home airfields. Mustangs would sweep in at low altitude, destroying parked aircraft before they could refuel or rearm. Each mission eroded German capability not just physically, but psychologically. The hunters who once controlled Europe's skies were now outnumbered, outflown, and outthought. The moral angle, Innovation at a human cost for the Americans. The results were undeniable. But victory came with its own questions. Was this new aggression saving bomber crews or sacrificing fighter pilots in pursuit of glory? Commanders debated fiercely. Some argued that breaking formation risked leaving bombers exposed to attack. Others countered that offensive sweeps actually reduced total losses by striking the Luftwaffe before it could form. In truth, both were right. Freedom of action brought both triumph and tragedy. Squadrons returning to base often counted missing pilots among their own. Men lost not to error, but to initiative. Every improvement in tactic came at a price in human life and endurance. Yet for those who fought, the justification was clear. If innovation could end the slaughter faster, then risk was its own form of mercy. By the spring of 1944, that logic had become doctrine. The U.S. fighter groups were no longer flying to protect. They were flying to destroy. And the skies over Germany were about to witness the proof. March the 6th, 1944, the first raid on Berlin. At dawn, over 700 B-17s and B-24s roared off from airfields across England. Their destination was the heart of Nazi Germany, the city no American bomber had yet dared to strike in daylight. It was a mission meant to break the Reich's will, or the 8th Air Force's nerve. Above them, the fighter escorts formed up. Sleek P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and a handful of P-38 Lightnings. For the first time, the bombers were protected from takeoff to target. Leading the sweep ahead of the formation were the 4th, 56th, and 357th Fighter Groups, the vanguard of the new doctrine. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. From bases near Hanover, Magdeburg, and Brunswick, over 500 German fighters took to the air. Jagdgeschwader 11, 26, and 54. Once the pride of the Luftwaffe, scrambled in coordinated waves. Their mission was clear: smash the bomber stream before it reached Berlin. But this time, the Americans were waiting, miles ahead of the bombers. Blakesley's and Zemke's groups intercepted the first German formations. The Mustangs slashed through the contrails, attacking head-on, diving through the enemy's ranks before climbing back into position. The radio channels filled with calm, clipped reports. One bandit down, second smoking, breaking high. German pilots, trained for defensive ambushes, found themselves fighting an opponent that dictated every move. The Americans no longer circled defensively. They hunted in pairs, striking from above, breaking away, then returning from unseen angles. Within an hour, the skies west of Berlin dissolved into chaos. Reports later described it as aerial anarchy. But to the U.S. command watching radar traces from England, it was controlled destruction. For the bombers, the difference was immediate. In earlier raids, B-17 losses often reached 20% or more. On the Berlin mission, despite fierce resistance, only a fraction of that number failed to return. The Luftwaffe, unable to mount concentrated attacks, had been broken apart before it could strike in mass. Over the next weeks, the new tactics continued to evolve. American groups began timing their sweeps to coincide with Luftwaffe scramble schedules. When radar detected German interceptors taking off, the Mustangs were already en route to meet them over their own airfields. The results were devastating. Dozens of German fighters were destroyed before they could even climb to altitude. Luftwaffe control officers, overwhelmed, began issuing desperate orders: do not engage without advantage. But by then, advantage was a luxury they no longer possessed. For the Americans, it was vindication, the proof that aggressive tactics and superior range could finally tip the balance. The once invincible Reich air defense network was beginning to unravel, and the pilots who had dared to defy orders now held the future of the air war in their hands. Yet the battle for the skies was not over. Because in the months that followed, the Luftwaffe would fight one last desperate campaign, a counterattack that would test every lesson the Americans had learned. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting for survival. Its veteran squadrons were exhausted, its fuel reserves shrinking, and its young pilots barely trained. Yet, orders from the Reich Air Ministry remained the same: defend the fatherland at all costs. To the men still flying from airfields in Germany, the sky had become a graveyard. The constant drone of Allied bombers filled the horizon, stretching from the Rhine to Saxony. Every dawn brought the same ritual: sirens, scramble orders, the roar of engines, and the haunting knowledge that few would return. On April 11th, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched another major raid. Nearly 900 bombers bound for Merseburg and Hanover, escorted by over 700 fighters. What awaited the Luftwaffe was not a defensive screen, but an aerial ambush. Zemke's Wolf Pack led the strike ahead of the bombers, diving into the German interceptors forming up over Brunswick. Minutes later, the 352nd and 357th Groups joined the melee. The sky erupted into streaks of vapor and burning wreckage. American pilots described it as one of the most chaotic battles of the war. Contrails twisting like ribbons, tracer fire glinting like lightning across the clouds. But amid that chaos, the results were unmistakable. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed in the air faster than it could replace its losses on the ground. Veteran German pilots, men who had survived since the Battle of Britain, now found themselves hopelessly outnumbered. Walter Oso, one of Germany's top aces, warned his superiors that the fighter arm is bleeding to death. His words were prophetic. By June 1944, Luftwaffe attrition had reached catastrophic levels. Nearly half of its remaining frontline fighters were lost in a single month. The once proud Jagdgeschwader units were now shells of their former selves. Squadrons that once fielded 40 aircraft were flying with barely a dozen. For the U.S. fighter groups, the transformation was absolute. Their missions no longer involved escorting bombers alone. They became the spearhead of air supremacy, ranging far beyond target zones, striking at rail yards, convoys, even aircraft factories themselves. The shift in confidence was palpable. Pilots who once counted survival by sorties now counted kills. Mustangs and Thunderbolts prowled the skies from dawn to dusk, chasing down anything that moved. And as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, that dominance became decisive. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe barely managed a token resistance over the beaches. Out of over 12,000 Allied aircraft in the invasion armada, only a handful were lost to enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been broken before the first Allied soldier stepped ashore. The skies over Germany now belonged to the Americans. It was the culmination of daring leadership, relentless adaptation, and the courage of pilots who turned defiance into doctrine. But victory in the air carried a heavy cost, and the aftermath of that triumph would reveal just how deeply it had reshaped the war itself. By the summer of 1944, the transformation of the European air war was complete. For the first time since 1939, Germany no longer controlled its own skies. The numbers told the story more clearly than any headline could. In late 1943, the average loss rate for U.S. bombers on deep penetration missions exceeded 15%. By August 1944, after the introduction of long-range escorts and offensive fighter tactics, that number had dropped below 3%. German fighter strength, meanwhile, collapsed with stunning speed. Between January and June 1944, Luftwaffe day fighter units lost over 3,000 aircraft and nearly as many experienced pilots. Replacement crews, some with less than 100 flying hours. were being thrown into combat against veterans trained in the crucible of hundreds of missions. Every victory in the air multiplied the effect on the ground. Without air cover, German transport convoys were shredded. Rail networks, fuel depots, and communication lines were systematically erased from the map. Fighter bombers prowled the countryside, destroying locomotives and trucks at will. It was not just an air campaign, it was economic strangulation from above. The change in pilot morale was just as profound. For the first time, American bomber crews took off with confidence that they might actually return. Debriefings at English bases grew less grim, the empty chairs in mess halls fewer. The psychological weight that had haunted crews after missions like Schweinfurt had begun to lift. Fighter pilots, too, felt the shift. They were no longer guardians chained to formation. They had become hunters, independent, calculating, relentless. Some units, like the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups, became near mythical among bomber crews, their names whispered with gratitude in briefing tents. For the Luftwaffe, however, each day in the air brought diminishing returns. Their once precise coordination unraveled into scattered, desperate sorties. Fuel shortages forced units to ration flights to a handful per week. Ground crews cannibalized wrecked aircraft for parts. Even the formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, machines once synonymous with dominance, could no longer turn the tide. In Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, issued orders that bordered on delusion, demanding all-out defense despite the collapse of resources and morale. His pilots, once symbols of invincibility, now called themselves Die Verlorenen, the lost ones. The air war that had begun as a contest of equals had become a one-sided campaign of annihilation. And yet, in the ruins of that dominance lay questions that even victory could not silence. Questions about how far innovation could go before it began to consume those who wielded it. When the guns, finally, fell silent in May 1945, the true extent of the air war's transformation came into focus. The Luftwaffe, once the sharpest weapon of the Third Reich, was gone, reduced to fragments scattered across the shattered airfields of Germany. Thousands of wrecked aircraft lay in rows, engines removed, wings torn apart. Post-war Allied studies confirmed what pilots already knew from experience. The turning point in the air war had not come from sheer numbers alone, but from the moment doctrine gave way to creativity. When the U.S. 8th Air Force adopted its seek and destroy philosophy, the Luftwaffe's structure began to collapse from within. The loss of its veteran corps created a chain reaction that crippled its training schools, supply lines, and morale. In reports compiled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, analysts concluded that Germany's defeat in the air had begun months before its armies fell on the ground. By early 1945, German aircraft production still functioned, but there were no trained pilots left to fly them, and no fuel to keep them airborne. Victory, the report noted, had come as much from the mind as from the machine. The technological legacy was equally profound. The P-51 Mustang had proven that a single aircraft could combine speed, range, and agility, setting a new standard for fighter design. Engineers studying post-war combat data built upon those lessons, leading to jet-age doctrines that would shape the wars in Korea and beyond. The idea of the fighter sweep, controlling enemy airspace through preemptive strikes, became a cornerstone of U.S. air power for decades to come. But among the men who fought, the memories were not of theory or doctrine. They were of faces, of moments, of loss. Pilots who survived dozens of missions often spoke quietly of those who hadn't. Some recalled returning to base to find empty bunks beside theirs, or ground crews quietly removing a pilot's name from the board. For all its tactical brilliance, the air war had extracted a merciless price. When Hubert Zemke visited post-war Germany as part of the occupation forces, he walked through hangars filled with broken Messerschmitts, machines he had once feared, now reduced to silence. Don Blakesley returned home and rarely spoke of the war, preferring to let his record, over 400 combat missions, speak for itself. Their legacy was more than victory. It was proof that in the crucible of war, innovation can emerge from defiance, and that courage is often found in the willingness to disobey. As historians later observed, the Luftwaffe lost its war when its enemies stopped following the rules. The skies over Europe, once filled with smoke and fire, had become symbols of something greater, the triumph of adaptability over arrogance, of freedom over fear. And in that quiet aftermath, as the last contrails faded, a new age of air power was born. In every war, there comes a moment when innovation outpaces tradition, when those who adapt endure. Over the skies of Europe, that moment came when American pilots broke away from formation and dared to think differently. Their radical tactics, free hunts, rolling scissors, diving attacks from altitude, were not just maneuvers. They were expressions of mindset, the courage to defy doctrine, to trust instinct, to fight on their own terms. The Luftwaffe had once ruled those same skies through fear and precision. But, as the war dragged on, its greatest weapon, discipline, became its greatest weakness. Bound by rigid command and dwindling resources, German pilots found themselves trapped inside a system that could no longer evolve. The Americans, by contrast, fought as individuals bound by purpose, not by order. Their commanders encouraged initiative, improvisation, even risk, because in chaos, opportunity lives. That philosophy, born in the freezing air above Germany, would later define modern air combat itself. Historians often measure the war in numbers: aircraft lost, bombs dropped, lives taken. But the true measure lies elsewhere, in how those who survived changed the art of warfare forever. From the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, the war was more than strategy. It was a test of imagination. And when imagination triumphed, it did so not in defiance of discipline, but because of it, because courage and creativity, when united, become unstoppable forces. In the decades that followed, every new generation of pilots, from the Korean Peninsula to the deserts of Iraq, carried echoes of those lessons learned high above the Reich. Innovation, adaptability, the will to fight smarter, not harder, and somewhere beyond the clouds, the contrails of those first radical pilots still linger. Silent reminders that sometimes the path to victory begins with the courage to break formation.